Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at Mallory and Irvine's oxygen use and the difference it made for their climb below 28,000 feet. The second video will look at their climb above 28,000 feet. But before we get started, here are the calculations of virtual altitude. That is, for a given altitude, oxygen flow rate, and breathing rate, how much difference does oxygen make for a bite valve oxygen system? It turns out quite a bit. Messner was right all along. Oxygen is cheating. It changes it into a completely different mountain. You can pause the video and go over the details, but in general, using oxygen at the flow rates Mallory and Irvine would have used makes the mountain about 5,000 to 8,000 feet lower. For this video, which looks at their climbing below 28,000 feet, their virtual altitude would have likely never been higher than North Col. A couple of notes on breathing rates. The following table shows the maximum voluntary ventilation rates for various types of athletes, where the amount is determined by recording 15 seconds of maximum ventilation. It is not realistic to sustain that rate for any significant period of time, but it does show that the rowers have some of the strongest lungs. Thus, Andrew Irvine was ideally suited because physical fitness is far more important than technical ability on Mount Everest. So this answers the age-old question of how could Mallory and Irvine have reached the summit when the best of the other pre-war expeditions only got to within 900 vertical feet, and that is, of course, because they used oxygen. The basics of the system Mallory and Irvine used were that it connected a bottle containing 535 liters of oxygen to a high-pressure tube that attached to a regulator and a needle valve. From there, a rubber tube would feed into a bladder bag, to which a bite valve was attached. The flow control is similar to that of a modern welding torch, in that the pressure is first reduced by a regulator and then fine-tuned by adjusting a needle valve. The regulator is slightly different from a standard regulator you might use in welding in that it was designed to reduce the pressure to a constant level. The initial design of the 1924 system attached a high-pressure tube to the bottle, and the regulator was located further away so that it could be adjusted by the climber without removing the backpack, similar to what is seen in this photo of the 1922 system. This caused numerous problems, with the high-pressure tube leaking because it needed to be flexible enough to wrap around to the front of the climber. Irvine solved the leaking problem by removing the high-pressure tube, or at least shortening it so that the regulator was positioned directly next to the bottle, similar to modern oxygen systems. The disadvantage is that you can no longer adjust the flow rate so easily while you're climbing. The advantage is the reduction in weight and the elimination of leaks from the high-pressure tube. Contrary to the books Ghost of Everest and Detectives on Everest, the flow rate for the oxygen system was variable between 0 and 3 liters a minute, with possibly being able to go higher. In some of my previous videos, I had used the information from Ghost of Everest, but now that information has been confirmed to be inaccurate. A very basic description of the oxygen system is provided by Pete Poston, and I link to that in the description, and he also confirms that the maximum flow rate was at least 3 liters per minute. So let's look at Mallory and Irvine's climb with oxygen, for which we have some information. They climbed to North Col on June 4th, with Irvine reporting using 1.5 liters per minute for the second half of the climb. They were not using oxygen for the first half. Their climb time was reported as 2 hours, 30 minutes. Even assuming the 2.5 hours started from the oxygen depot slightly higher than advanced base camp, this still has them climbing from 21,325 feet to 23,000 feet at a rate of 670 vertical feet per hour. For the next climbs on June 6th and 7th, we know they used a total of 90 atmospheres to climb a total of 3,700 feet. Each bottle was filled to 120 atmospheres at standard temperature. However, at the temperatures relevant to Mallory and Irvine, a full bottle would only read 110 atmospheres. It was not that the bottles were leaking, it was that the laws of physics apply equally to people climbing Mount Everest. Thus, the 90 atmospheres Mallory reported would be about 82% of a bottle and equal 438 liters of oxygen. We do not know the exact climb times, but they were climbing with Sherpas who were carrying the fairly heavy loads of the additional 6 oxygen bottles as well as provisions. Mallory and Irvine carried 2 bottles each, thus there were 10 total bottles brought up to high camp. 2 largely were expended in the climb to reach high camp. There has been some debate about whether Mallory was carrying 1 or 2 cylinders, as the second cylinder is just barely visible in this photo. However, if he was only carrying 1 cylinder, it would have been mounted in the center to avoid such an unbalanced load. as a clearly visible cylinder is not mounted in the center, he was carrying 2 cylinders. In addition, Odell stated they were carrying 2 cylinders each. In 1922, Mallory, Norton, and Somerville had made the climb from the 1922 Camp 5 to their high point at 26,985 feet at a rate of 317 vertical feet per hour. Now, for Mallory and Irvine to have climbed only 317 vertical feet per hour over the 2 days we know they used 438 liters of oxygen each would require a flow rate of just 0.6 liters per minute. It is very unlikely they use such a low flow rate. Instead, using 1 liter a minute, this gives a climb rate of 507 vertical feet per hour, which is probably at the limit of what the Sherpa would have been able to climb at. Now, for all the haters, you are welcome to adjust the variables however you want. But if you increase the rate of oxygen Mallory and Irvine were climbing at on June 6th and 7th, then their rate of ascent has to go up because we know they only used 438 liters to climb 3,700 vertical feet. If you want to say they were climbing on 1.5 liters per minute, that is fine. It means they were climbing 760 vertical feet per hour. At 2 liters per minute, it is 1,014 vertical feet per hour. Given the difficulty in adjusting the flow rate while climbing, it is unlikely they were turning it on and off or that they were adjusting it numerous times while they were climbing. Perhaps they climbed on 1 liter per minute the first day and 1.5 liters per minute the second day, but for simplicity, for the climbs on June 6th and 7th, using just a constant 1 liter per minute, the 507 vertical feet per hour is in line with the oxygen equipment manufacturer's recommendation that the flow be adjusted to climb at 600 vertical feet per hour. The 507 vertical feet per hour is probably at the limit of what the Sherpa could sustain, so that is likely the flow rate they climbed at. We can also put a lower bound on Mallory and Irvine's ascent rate for June 6th. We know they left North Col at 8:40 a.m. when this picture was taken, and that their Sherpas returned to North Col at about 5 p.m. Setting 2 hours as the fastest possible descent rate for the Sherpa, this gives 6 hours and 20 minutes for 2,200 vertical feet as the lower bound on Mallory and Irvine's ascent rate. This comes to 347 vertical feet per hour. It also essentially rules out any extremely rapid rates, such as the 1,014 feet necessary for a 2 liter per minute flow rate, as that would leave the Sherpa spending an inexplicable amount of time at Camp 5 before they descended. As soon as you start plugging in actual numbers to the known facts, you quickly see that the so-called mysteries of the climb disappear like a Yeti when you take out a camera. Going to the night of June 7th, they had 8 full bottles of oxygen at high camp and could easily split a bottle to sleep on as the regulators had a built-in split valve. That is, all you had to do is remove a cap and attach your bladder bag to the second nozzle of the regulator, and this acted as a second breathing tube, which could be used when sleeping or in an emergency if one of the apparatuses stopped functioning. It is worth looking at what the split valve would mean for their climb. The bite valve is a tube that you stick in your mouth. When you exhale, you bite down and it cuts off the flow of oxygen into your mouth. The reason for this is that you don't want oxygen entering your mouth when you are exhaling. It would just be blowing out into the atmosphere, and roughly 1/2 the total oxygen would be wasted. Modern masks use flap valves to control this, but they have the problem that they freeze up. If they freeze open, you are not only blowing the oxygen into the atmosphere, but you have increased the dead space in the mask by the size of the bladder bag. If the valve freezes closed, you don't get any oxygen, and your system then eventually starts to leak. The 1922 expedition had flap valve masks, and it is not clear if these were also provided in 1924. If they were, there is no record of them being used, and Mallory is clearly using the bite valve system in this photo, as the external bladder bag is clearly visible. The bite valve is far more efficient, and it cannot break. The reason it is not used for modern climbers is that it is uncomfortable, and it also requires discipline to use. You need a steady rhythm for your breath. However, the uncomfortable part is also a key asset for Mallory and Irvine. When you have the tube in your mouth, you need to move it from side to side to keep that part of your mouth from freezing, from being exposed to the high-speed, low-temperature oxygen coming out of the tube. I use such a method, and you need to move it around every couple of minutes. The advantage to this is that if your oxygen runs out, you will know it immediately. On modern systems, they make a fairly loud hissing sound, and most people can hear that, but sometimes they tune it out while they're climbing. And most modern systems also have a flow indicator, but if you're not looking at it, it will not alert you to having ran out of oxygen. In contrast, if Mallory or Irvine had run out of oxygen or had a system failure, they would know it immediately. They also had the perfect backup plan, the second nozzle on their partner's regulator. So if either one had a malfunction in their equipment, they would just indicate to the other and attach their hose to that person's second nozzle and start their descent. This also made it easy to sleep with, as you just need a single bottle in the tent and you could split it between two people. A single bottle at 1 liter per minute would split to 1/2 a liter per minute for both of them and last 535 minutes or 8.9 hours. The mask Mallory and Irvine used was only there to hold the tube in place while you slept, and you would obviously not be using the bite valve while you were asleep. The mask was not necessary while climbing, and you could just hold the tube in your mouth using the bite valve. The bite valve is a major advantage for the 1924 system over modern mask systems. Masks restrict your breathing in an environment where breathing is the most important thing. Masks also restrict visibility and can fog up your goggles, as exhaled air will be blown up and over your goggles rather than straight out unless you have an extremely tight seal on your mask. So going back to the night of June 7th, Odell reported, "I stretched myself diagonally across the tiny tent in an endeavor to obtain what sleep I might pending a visit from the notorious Scupas, or even the watchdogs of Chumulungma. For all I know, none put in an appearance, and even the wind did not attain its usual boisterous degree, or threaten to start the somewhat precarious built-up platform on which the tent was perched from a glissade down the mountainside. I kept reasonably warm, and consequently had a fair amount of sleep. Thus, according to Odell, there was little to no wind the night of June 7th, and the weather was warm. As Mallory noted, perfect weather for the job." Now for June 8th, we have to try to figure out how many oxygen bottles they took. I used 3 bottles each because they had a large amount of oxygen in high camp, and it appears their initial ascent rate out of high camp was somewhat slower than the days prior. That is, if they only carried 2 bottles on the summit bid, they would have started out at about the same speed they climbed the day before, when they were also carrying 2 cylinders each. They could easily adjust the flow of oxygen up slightly to compensate for the increase in altitude. However, carrying an additional bottle is going to slow you down no matter what virtual altitude you carry it at. So you are welcome to come up with your own theory, but it needs to reflect realistic numbers. If they were climbing 507 vertical feet per hour the day prior using just 1 liter a minute, when we know they were carrying just 2 bottles each at that time, there has to be some explanation as to why they couldn't at least start out at 507 vertical feet per hour, and some explanation as to why they would have slowed, given that they could have increased their oxygen flow above 1 liter per minute. Now, the fact that the climb on June 8th had more traversing than the straight-up climbing of June 6th and 7th can explain some of the slowed vertical ascent rate, but you should have some rational relationship between your theory and the known facts. Norton and Somerville left the exact same camp at 6:40 a.m. on June 4th and reached 28,000 feet by noon when Somerville broke down. Using 26,700 feet for Camp 6, this gives a vertical ascent rate of 244 vertical feet per hour. If your theory has them climbing slower than Norton and Somerville, who were not using oxygen, you need some explanation as to how Mallory and Irvine were able to climb so rapidly for the 2 prior days when they had a very low flow of oxygen and were known to be carrying only 2 bottles each. For my analysis, I have them start out carrying 3 bottles each and using 1.5 liters per minute as the minimum amount they would climb on. 3 bottles is 1,605 liters, or 17.8 hours at 1.5 liters per minute, or 8.91 hours at 3 liters per minute. Here, I'll take a little diversion to discuss whether they had enough oxygen for the climb. Likely the last 900 feet, that is the area starting at the zigzag, or if they took the couloir in that same area, they would need to be climbing using 3 liters a minute. Using Hillary and Norgay's ascent rate of 180 vertical feet per hour, this comes to roughly 5 hours to reach the summit from 28,100 feet. On the descent, they could turn down to 1.5 liters per minute, and assuming they use 1.5 for the rest of the climb, that would leave 7.8 hours of oxygen at 1.5 liters per minute. That is simply not enough oxygen. Even assuming they could somehow sprint back from the summit to high camp in just 4 hours, this means they would have to reach 28,100 feet in just 3.8 hours, or 368 vertical feet per hour. This is not realistic, given that they would have been carrying 3 bottles for half that time. It is close, but they would have had to climb on less than 3 liters a minute for the difficult portions and have had everything go perfectly to have enough oxygen. Obviously, everything did not go perfectly. And this sets up to where I will get into the second video on the oxygen, that at some point they ran out of oxygen. The majority of their oxygen, 900 of their 1,605 liters, would have been used in the last 900 feet of the climb. Had they turned around below the 3rd step, they would have had plenty of oxygen. Had they turned around at the base of the false summit, they would have been cutting it close, but still had oxygen. So if your theory has them running out of oxygen at some point in their climb, then you must have them reaching above the 3rd step. The notion that they headed over to the 2nd step, both turned up their oxygen to 3 liters per minute, and then spent 5 hours pointlessly clawing at the rock before they turned around is not a theory. It is a fairy tale. But even if you go with that theory, that would still leave them with enough oxygen for their entire climb. If your theory involves them running out of oxygen, then your theory needs to have them above the 3rd step. Either that, or you have them leaving almost 50% of their oxygen in high camp for some unknown reason. The notion that they could have climbed on 1.5 liters per minute, giving them almost 18 hours of oxygen, is also not realistic. That is essentially saying they planned on dying, because descending at night after climbing so many hours can only be done by studying the thoughts of Chairman Mao, like the Chinese claimed to have done in 1960. A realistic theory will have them climb on 1.5 liters for some period lower down and on the descent, but there is no way they planned on climbing on 1.5 liters the entire time. Similarly, they were not complete morons, and they would not suddenly turn the oxygen to 3 liters per minute right out of high camp, nor any other significantly high flow rate. Given that they were not seen until 1250 at the 3rd step, it is unlikely they were climbing on a high flow rate the entire time. Here, I will also briefly mention another find in the Royal Geographic Society archives, and that is a letter written to Norton questioning his initial and subsequent statements about what Odell told him. Although we do not have Norton's initial correspondence, the letter, which appears to have been from Hanks, indicates that Norton's statements are contradictory. There is a quote from an earlier Norton letter where Norton wrote that the position Odell indicated he saw Mallory and Irvine was 300 feet higher than Norton's high point. In the letter, Hinks is having trouble reconciling that with Norton's later statements about the location being so far away from the summit because the location 300 feet above Norton's high point can't exist that far away from the summit. Given that Mallory and Irvine were sighted reaching the crest of the ridge, there is exactly one location it could possibly be, and that is 300 feet above where Norton's high point was. That letter is in the RGS, so I can't show it here, but all the initial accounts now put Mallory and Irvine at the 3rd step, with all the subsequent revisions trying to push the sighting further down the mountain. Returning to their climb below 28,000 feet, the main issue is the oxygen bottle, or bottles, that were found somewhere between the exit cracks and the base of the 1st step. We don't know who originally found them. We don't know where they were originally found. We don't know the location Tap Richards supposedly picked a single bottle up from, as that has changed numerous times over the years. We don't know whether Tap Richards photographed the bottle prior to picking it up. We don't have the description of the rock that Eric Simonson supposedly told him to go look under. We don't know whether the bottle still had oxygen in it, and we don't know its current location. It is not at the Royal Geographical Society, the Alpine Club, nor Mallory's archive in Cambridge. The initial excuse that Tap Richards and Jake Norton were too exhausted to document anything about the bottle is contradicted by Ghost of Everest, that has Richards and Norton stopping at the 1933 high camp on their way down and conducting an inventory where they noted a tent pole, some rope, a pack frame, and pieces of tent in a sleeping bag. The pack frame then magically shows up in base camp, and it is not clear who collected it, but the Sherpa had already descended in front of Norton and Richards, and it is not likely Anker or Hahn would have searched for it in their descent, as it was already dark. And when both Jake Norton and Tap Richard returned in 2001, no effort was made to photograph or identify the location the oxygen bottle was supposedly found in. As with everything about the 1999 expedition, who found what and when and where things were recovered from remains a complete mystery. The notes found in Mallory's pocket, other than the letters from his family and friends, have also gone missing. We do have the photograph of the single envelope where Mallory noted the pressures of various oxygen bottles, but if Mallory did make any additional notes about his oxygen use or what time he reached certain cache points, it remains a mystery, as the 1999 team has not released all the photos of those notes. A few photographs of a page here and there have been released, but nowhere close to everything. The letters from Mallory's family and friends found on his body are in the Cambridge archive, but the location of the numerous other notes remain an Everest mystery. For the oxygen bottle, any location below the first step indicates it was placed there as part of a caching scheme. The most logical explanation for what happened comes from Peter Furstbrook's account that 2 bottles were found. Where they were found was most likely in the location originally reported in National Geographic, which is close to the exit cracks. Mallory and Irvine would have cached the bottles there after about 3 hours of climbing on 1.5 liters per minute. This gives a vertical ascent rate of 353 vertical feet per hour, reflecting that they were carrying 3 bottles. From the oxygen bottle cache, wherever you want to place it below the first step, they would then traverse over to the base of the first step, taking between 30 minutes and an hour, depending on where exactly you placed it. This brings them to approximately 28,000 feet, averaging 350 vertical feet per hour, and they would have just under 2 full bottles each that they are carrying, and 1 bottle each at the cache point, being just less than half full. And this is where the next video will pick up.